This is a story about women's exploitation, specifically in Hollywood, and the unrealistic beauty standards of the modern era. It's a very specific type of movie that you've probably seen many times before. In fact, this type of premise, I've seen, I don't even know how many times, maybe 100, and every time I see it, I enjoy it, but I just want it to be done slightly different. And I was worried for that going in. And about halfway through, I was still worried for it, because these movies just have such a specific way that they tell their story, and they kind of go in the ways you expect them to go, which is kind of a knock on horror movies, because typically you get a couple different premises and they all kind of go the same way. I mean, all the Conjuring movies are basically the same movie with just character names moved around and a new demon. Most horror movies are just like, yeah, okay, there's a family, someone gets possessed slowly, people don't believe them, then they believe them, then something shows up to help them, it doesn't work, then something else shows up to help them, and then it kind of goes crazy, and then it works. Kind of a generic premise you've seen before. Now, The Substance does feel like that, because it is a movie about a specific topic that has been covered well before already. The basic premise is that this kind of washed-up actor Demi Moore plays is trying to get her life back, or back on track, because in Hollywood, so many of the roles for big films are for beautiful people, and for good reason. Now, obviously, we would love to change that, and there's a lot of really talented actors that break through that aren't the stereotypically pretty people. But because Hollywood is putting on a show, they want to get the most beautiful, the most eye-popping people possible to make their movies pop. And so it does make sense in that regard, but of course, the unrealisticness of the beauty that's portrayed on screen and the fallout of when the actors lose that beauty is exactly what this movie's dealing with. And it's that kind of tough topic that horror can tackle.
People always ask for something new. It's inevitable. At 50, well, it stops.
Demi Moore in real life is 61 years old, and her glory days, her peak of her beauty, I mean, she's one of the most beautiful women in the world, even to this day, but her peak is gone, and when that goes, a lot of roles dry up. So in this movie, that exact thing happens in the first act. She loses basically all of her stuff, all of her roles, and she just kind of becomes aimless. And then as if she's in a movie, she gets delivered this thing that is going to help her be young again, which is essentially the premise. This thing is called the substance, and it allows her to make a younger version of herself that they can trade places with every 7 days. One is beautiful 29-year-old Margaret Qualley, one is 61-year-old Demi Moore, and they just trade places every week, and they try to go about their lives. Even though they're the same person, they have very distinct, different lives. And that's essentially the premise. And stop me if you've heard this before. Having her looks back, suddenly she doesn't want to go back into her old body, and chaos ensues. This is a premise as old as time, really, and there are many films that this is kind of dedicated to. There's so much cinema in this movie, and I loved it. There's so much that it's referencing. I mean, there's a 2001 A Space Odyssey reference in this. David Cronenberg is a big inspiration of this, it seems. The Rejuvenator film is an inspiration for it, clearly. So there's a lot that this is paying homage to, which I really loved about it. And it's not something I necessarily expected, because you don't have to do that when you're making a movie. You don't have to make a movie that's similar to other movies and then pay respect to those movies. But this does, and I loved that about it. And I also loved that this movie decides to go balls to the wall style. And I think that's great. We need more movies to go weird and do extreme things, because that is what makes movies feel alive. That's what art is about, is going to extremes, and sometimes it doesn't quite work. There's plenty of ambitious failures that I still kind of like, even if they don't quite reach the heights they want to. But this movie hits all the notes it wants to while also being extreme and really shooting for the moon. And I mean, the last 30 minutes, it really shoots for the moon.
They're gonna love that.
But let's go back to its thematics, which is one of the most interesting parts of the film, and that, again, is the exploitation of women, the unrealistic beauty standards, etc., etc. And it does it in a way that I found very unique and enjoyable. It's beating you over the head with a sledgehammer, and at times I think it goes maybe one step too far, but that's really my only negative of the film, because the rest is just so great at what it's accomplishing. The young version of Demi Moore, played by Margaret Qualley, who is Sue in the film, is fantastic. And I loved that this film really adopts the idea of the male gaze to really tie a bow on its message. The whole film, if it was made by a man, I don't know if it would be perceived different. I don't think so, but maybe. But because it's directed by a woman, there is this undertone of like, this is what the male gaze looks like to me, the woman director. I mean, Demi Moore's character, who again is 60, is shot kind of generic, shot like a regular movie in these either extreme close-ups, these mediums, wide, some extreme fisheye lenses, but nothing too crazy. A lot of what she's shot with is pretty standard, whereas Sue, the young version of herself that's super hot, is shot like a Carl's Jr. ad from 2008.
Should we tell him it's both?
But every shot of Sue is lingering on her ass and her boobs and like her smile, and it gets these really slow-mo close-up shots of her like almost twerking, and it, in any other context, it would feel exploitative, but because of its message, it is hilarious. The humor of the film really does come out of that absurdity, because it is so over the top. Every character is like a cartoon, and by the end, there is an explosion of blood that is rocketing over this crowd of live audience members that had me in actual tears because I was laughing so hard. It is just so absurd, and Dennis Quaid's character is so over the top. Everything he does, he's so animated. He's like yelling every line of dialogue. He's smiling like a crazy person. He's fantastic. All the acting is so good in this, but because it's so over the top, that style and those visual metaphors feel right at home. In any other situation, I probably would be criticizing it, but it just works so well here because it is like watching a cartoon. Like when it's played really straight like it is at the beginning, it's uncomfortable. It's kind of that David Cronenberg type of body horror where it's gross more than it is comedic, but at the end then it just goes completely into the comedic realm, and as much blood as is possible is thrown on screen. But that's the interesting tightrope that this film is walking, is it is trying to be a very poignant commentary while also being a very funny and entertaining movie. And that's something that almost nothing can accomplish, but this does. I honestly don't know how they pulled it off, but the balance is so perfect. And I think it does go back to that cartooniness of it. Even in the first 5 minutes of the film, it's a complete cartoon. And I loved that the main character, Demi Moore, is almost a character out of time. It gives it this real timeless quality. Even though it's clearly set in the modern era, like there's Teslas whipping around, there's flat screen TVs, she's still reading the newspaper, she's still using a vacuum from like 1975, and she's still using landlines. She's a person that is completely out of her time. Even her exercise TV show that she runs is straight out of the 80s, which they make a commentary on. It's like the Jurassic fitness, and it does feel like that. It feels like she is losing her place in time while losing her place in her industry, in her field. And that's something I found very interesting, and maybe why the shooting style feels different between her and Sue, because Sue is that hot new thing. She's the big ticket item who also is doing a fitness program, because I guess in this version of Hollywood, the pinnacle of your career is doing fitness programs. It's bizarre, but it works again because it's so stupid and funny. And that's no more punctuated than it is with their fitness shows. Demi Moore's is shot very traditionally, like an 80s fitness where it's just kind of one lockdown shot, whereas Sue's fitness program, Pump It Up, is shot with these sweeping camera movements, this really high fidelity digital image, and she's just twerking and going crazy on stage, looking as hot as possible. When I think of films like this, I think of movies like The Neon Demon, though, where it's playing with the exact same type of thing. Beauty expectations, models that are jealous of other people because of their beauty. But this is such a unique take because so much of it feels meta, not just for the reasons I've discussed, like the director using the male gaze to make her point, or Demi Moore, a washed-up actor playing a washed-up actor, or Sue, who is a hot young thing, just playing the vapid, hollow behind the eyes hot young thing, who also happens to be the 60-year-old person putting herself in the young girl's body. There's so much meta going on, and there's so much to digest because of that.
Pretty girls should always smile.
Don't necessarily need to have the most complex characters. I talk about this so often, where if you have a good story, you don't need characters. But if you have a bad story, you absolutely do need characters. And this movie is so perfect from a storytelling perspective and from a filmmaking's perspective. It didn't need these characters to be that interesting. In fact, Demi Moore's character is nothing more than a washed-up actor who's trying to relive her glory days. That's really it. She has a minor arc where she realizes she's gone too far, and the young version of herself, Sue, is just basically nothing. It's just like a conduit for Demi Moore to pretend like she's someone else. The characters are nothing, really. They're just traits for a script to push forward. And it's completely fine because that story is so strong, because that message is so strong, because the filmmaking is so strong, and the undercurrents and the themes are so strong. It just works. And again, I think it goes all the way back to the fact that it's a horror movie, because this type of story is difficult to tell if it's not a horror story. Don't get me wrong, there's lots of great dramas, comedies, and other genres that deal with this same type of subject matter, exploitation of women. The Assistant was a great film that was just a basic drama of a woman who is basically Harvey Weinstein's assistant, and it's this stark and dramatic thing. So you can do things like that in other genres, but that movie isn't entertaining. That movie is just kind of like, oh, gross. And it gets its point across, and it's well made, and it's great. But I don't want to watch that movie again. But because The Substance is specifically a horror movie, it can just bend and mold its genre to its will. The Assistant is very limited by its genre, whereas this can be body horror, it can be a dark comedy, it can be a drama, it can be whatever it wants, so it is whatever it wants. And that's so great. We need more like it. Why are we confining ourselves to specific genres and just doing one thing? Why are we confining ourselves to, hey, this is a demon movie, so it's gotta be a generic demon movie? Why are we doing that to ourselves? We don't need to. You can go crazy. You can do what this does, which tells a familiar story in a familiar way, but ratchets everything up to 12 and then has one of the craziest endings in a film you'll see this year. It's 2 hours and 20 minutes, and it races by. There was no point where I was bored. I never checked my watch. I was even writing notes in my notebook, and at one point I literally just stopped because I was so involved with the movie. That's what we need. We need more of this. I'm never going to be the guy that says that Hollywood's out of ideas or that movies are getting worse, because they're not. There's just more movies now because they're getting easier and easier to make. There are great filmmakers making movies with iPhones now, and there are terrible filmmakers making movies with iPhones. So the barrier to entry to make a movie is significantly lower, which means we're just getting more volume of things. There are probably more bad movies now than there were even 10 years ago, but there are as many, if not significantly more, great movies being made now because of that low barrier to entry, because we have so many creative people that now have an outlet that they can utilize because of that barrier to entry. And I just hope that more filmmakers do stuff like this.